What if everything you were taught about America was a carefully constructed lie? What if the history books in your schools, the documentaries on your screens, and the stories passed down through generations were designed not to inform you, but to control you? Today we pull back the curtain. We go beyond the textbooks, beyond the propaganda, beyond the myths. This is the hidden history of the United States of America. What if everything you were taught about America was a carefully constructed lie? What if the history books in your schools, the documentaries on your screens, and the stories passed down through generations were designed not to inform you, but to control you? What if the very nation you were told to be proud of was built on secrets so dark, so deliberately hidden, that the people who uncovered them were silenced, discredited, or destroyed? Today, we are not here to attack America. We are here to understand it, truly understand it, because you cannot fix what you refuse to see. You cannot change what you are never allowed to question. And you cannot be free if you are living inside a story written by the people who profit from your ignorance. This is the hidden history of the United States of America, and it begins long before 1776. Most people believe America was founded on the principles of freedom, democracy, and equality. These are beautiful words, powerful words, words that have inspired revolutions across the entire world. But here is the brutal truth they never taught you in school. When the Founding Fathers signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, proudly proclaiming then our created equal, over 500,000 human beings were enslaved on American soil. Not metaphorically enslaved, not economically struggling, but literally owned, bought and sold like property, stripped of their names, their families, their languages, their humanity. Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote those immortal words, "All men are created equal," owned over 600 slaves in his lifetime. He wrote about freedom with one hand and signed slave sale documents with the other. George Washington, the father of the nation, the man whose face is printed on every single dollar bill, owned 317 slaves. James Madison, the architect of the United States Constitution, owned over 100 human beings. These were not men fighting for universal freedom. These were wealthy landowners, plantation owners, merchants and lawyers, protecting their economic interests and building a nation that would serve them first, their class second, and everyone else almost not at all. The American Revolution was not a revolution for the people. It was a revolt of the colonial elite against British taxation. It was a business decision dressed up in the language of liberty. And it worked, because 250 years later, people are still quoting those words, without asking who they were really written for. Before there was a United States of America, there was a civilization. Not one civilization, hundreds of them. Hundreds of Native American nations stretching from coast to coast. Tens of millions of people living on this land. Complex societies with their own governments, legal systems, trade networks, agricultural innovations, spiritual traditions, and cultural histories stretching back over 15,000 years. This was not empty land. This was not a wilderness waiting to be discovered. This was home to some of the most sophisticated civilizations on the planet. And in less than 300 years, it was nearly all erased. The U.S. government signed over 500 treaties with Native American tribes. Treaties are legal agreements, binding contracts, sacred promises. The United States government broke every single one of them. Every single one. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, a man celebrated as a great American hero, forcibly displaced entire nations from their ancestral homelands at gunpoint. Families were torn from the land their ancestors had lived on for thousands of years. The Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee Nation was marched hundreds of miles on foot through brutal winter conditions with little food, no shelter, and no mercy, killed an estimated 4,000 to 8,000 people. Entire generations, grandparents, children, infants dead on the side of the road. And yet Andrew Jackson's face still appears on the American $20 bill, a man responsible for ethnic cleansing, honored on the currency of the nation he helped shape. Ask yourself, why is that face still there? By the late 1800s, America had a new kind of ruler, not kings wearing crowns, not generals on horseback, something far more powerful and far more invisible: corporations. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled over 90% of all oil refining in the entire United States. He didn't just dominate the market, he destroyed competition, bribed politicians, and built a private economic empire larger than many countries. Andrew Carnegie dominated the steel industry, supplying the raw material for America's explosive industrial growth, while paying his workers barely enough to survive. J.P. Morgan controlled banking, railroads, and electricity, essentially controlling the financial bloodstream of the entire nation. These men were called captains of industry in your textbooks. Visionaries, pioneers, heroes of American capitalism. But the workers in their factories, the miners in their coal pits, the children laboring in their mills, they called them something very different. Robber barons. Men who built their fortunes not through genius alone, but through exploitation and brutality. They paid starvation wages while living in palaces. They hired Pinkerton agents, private armed mercenaries, to beat and shoot striking workers who dared to ask for basic human rights. They bribed senators openly. They purchased judges like furniture. They rewrote laws to protect their wealth and criminalize resistance. The Ludlow Massacre of 1914, where John D. Rockefeller's hired gunmen opened fire on a tent colony of striking coal miners and then set it ablaze, killed men, women, and children. Burned alive. For going on strike, this event was buried, hidden, removed from the national conversation. Because the men who owned the mines also owned the newspapers. Here is something they definitely did not teach you in school. In 1983, approximately 50 corporations controlled the majority of American media, newspapers, television, radio, and film. By 2011, that number had collapsed to just six corporations, 6 boardrooms, controlling the information diet of over 330 million Americans every single day. Comcast, Disney, News Corp, Time Warner, CBS, Viacom, and who sits on the boards of these 6 companies, look the same bankers, the same defense industry executives, the same political donors, the same families. When media is owned by the powerful decide what becomes news and what gets buried in silence. The same corporations that manufacture weapons fund the television networks that tell you which countries are enemies. The same financial institutions that profit from economic collapse own the newspapers that explain why the collapse was unavoidable. The same pharmaceutical companies that sell you medicine advertise on the health channels that tell you what to be afraid of. This is not conspiracy. This is not theory. This is publicly documented, legally registered, corporate ownership, hiding in plain sight. So why does any of this matter? Why does it matter what happened 200 years ago, or 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago? It matters because history is not just the past. History is a weapon. When you control the story of where a nation came from, you control the story of where it is going. When you erase the crimes of the powerful from public memory, you give them silent permission to commit new ones. When you teach children that their nation has always been righteous, you make it almost impossible for them to recognize when it is not. The hidden history of America is not simply a story of bad people doing bad things. It is a story of systems. Systems deliberately designed to concentrate power in the hands of the few. Systems built to manufacture consent among the many. Systems engineered to keep the majority of people just comfortable enough, just distractible enough, just divided enough, to never truly unite and demand something better. But you are here, you are watching, you are asking questions, and that is exactly where everything begins to change. In part 2, we go even deeper into the darkness. The secret societies operating behind the walls of American power. The political assassinations that were never fully solved. The shadow networks that have shaped every major war and every economic crisis and every election of the modern era. The truth does not stop here. It has only just begun. In part 1, we exposed the foundation, the lies written into the birth certificate of a nation, the stolen land, the enslaved people, the robber barons, the media machine. But that was only the surface. Because beneath the surface of American democracy, beneath the elections, the speeches, the flags, and the freedom, there exists another America. An America that was never voted into power. An America that was never elected, never appointed, never announced. An America that operates in the shadows and has been pulling the strings of this nation for well over a century. Welcome to Part 2, The Hidden History of the USA. Let us begin with a question that most historians refuse to ask out loud. Who really controls America? Not the president, not the Congress, not the Supreme Court. These are the visible faces of power, the performers on the stage. But every stage has a backstage, and backstage in America, the real decisions have always been made by a network of extraordinarily powerful men who answer to no election, no law, and no public scrutiny whatsoever. In 1910, a group of the most powerful bankers in America secretly boarded a private train in New Jersey. They traveled under false names. They told no one where they were going. Their destination was Jekyll Island, a private resort off the coast of Georgia, accessible only to the ultra-wealthy elite. For 9 days, in complete secrecy, these men, representing nearly 1/4 of the entire wealth of the world, designed a new American banking system, a system that would give private banks control over the money supply of the United States government. 3 years later, in 1913, their plan became law. It was called the Federal Reserve Act. And with a single signature, the United States government handed control of its monetary system to a privately owned central bank. Think about what that means. Every dollar printed in America, every interest rate set, every decision about whether the economy expands or contracts is made not by elected officials, but by private bankers. Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr. warned the American people at the time. He said this act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. From this date, depression to be scientifically created. He was not speaking in metaphor. In 1929, just 16 years after the Federal Reserve was created, the American economy collapsed in the greatest financial disaster in modern history. The Great Depression. Millions lost everything. Banks failed overnight. Families were thrown into the streets. And while ordinary Americans stood in bread lines stretching around entire city blocks, the same bankers who designed the Federal Reserve System quietly bought up assets, properties, and businesses at pennies on the dollar. The rich got richer during the Great Depression, and the system that allowed it was the same system they had secretly designed on Jekyll Island 19 years before. But the banking system is just one thread in a much larger web. Because running parallel to the financial structure of America, there has always been a shadow political structure, secret societies, private clubs, hidden networks of power that connect politics, banking, intelligence, and media into one unified system of control. Skull and Bones, founded at Yale University in 1832, a secret society so exclusive, so secretive, that for over 150 years its members have refused to publicly discuss what happens inside its walls. And yet, the list of its members reads like a who's who of American power. President William Howard Taft, President George Herbert Walker Bush, President George W. Bush, Senator John Kerry, CIA directors, Supreme Court justices, cabinet members, defense secretaries. 2 men ran against each other for the presidency of the United States in 2004, George W. Bush and John Kerry. Both were members of the same secret society. Both had taken the same secret oath. Both refused to discuss it publicly. The American people were given a choice between 2 candidates who belonged to the same secret brotherhood. Is that democracy? Or is that theater? Then there is the Council on Foreign Relations, founded in 1921, a private organization of 5,000 members, drawn from the highest levels of American government, military, banking, media, and academia. Every Secretary of State since the 1940s has been a member, nearly every CIA director, dozens of senators, the presidents of major universities, the editors of major newspapers, the CEOs of major corporations. The Council on Foreign Relations does not hold public elections. It publishes no minutes of its meetings. It answers to no government oversight. And yet, it has shaped the foreign policy of the United States for over 100 years. Wars have been started based on decisions made in its private rooms. Governments of other countries have been overthrown based on strategies developed in its meetings. Millions of people around the world have had their lives changed, or ended, by the decisions of men who were never voted into any position of power. Now let us talk about something even darker. The assassinations. Because in American history, there is a pattern, a deeply disturbing pattern, of leaders who challenged the system ending up dead. Abraham Lincoln challenged powerful banking interests and was assassinated in 1865. President James Garfield opposed the banking cartel and was assassinated in 1881. President William McKinley challenged corporate power and was assassinated in 1901. And then there was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, a man who, in the final years of his life, was moving in directions that terrified the most powerful institutions in America. Kennedy signed Executive Order 1110, which gave the U.S. Treasury the power to issue currency directly, bypassing the Federal Reserve. He was pulling American troops out of Vietnam, ending a war that was generating billions of dollars for the military-industrial complex. He was attempting to dismantle the CIA after the Bay of Pigs disaster, telling colleagues he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. He was opening secret back-channel communications with the Soviet Union, threatening the Cold War narrative that kept defense budgets astronomically high. On November 29, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, John F. Kennedy was shot and killed. The Warren Commission concluded it was a lone gunman, a single bullet, a single disturbed individual acting alone. But the House Select Committee on Assassinations, a U.S. government investigation conducted in 1979, concluded that Kennedy was probably killed as the result of a conspiracy. Probably. A conspiracy. Admitted by the United States government itself. And yet the full classified files on the Kennedy assassination were withheld from the public for over 60 years. 60 years of secrets. Ask yourself, what is in those files that required 60 years of silence? The hidden history of America is not ancient. It is not over. It is happening right now. The same systems that enslaved people in 1776 evolved into systems that exploit workers in 1900. The same systems that massacred Native Americans evolved into foreign policies that destroy nations abroad. The same secret networks that designed the Federal Reserve in 1910 are the same networks making financial decisions today. The names change, the faces change, the technology changes. But the system remains. And understanding that system, seeing it clearly, without fear, without denial, is the first and most important act of resistance available to any human being alive today. In Part 3, we go further. The wars that were started on lies. The weapons of mass destruction that never existed. The Gulf of Tonkin incident that never happened. And the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower himself warned you about in his final address to the American nation. The story continues. And the deeper we go, the more important it becomes that you keep watching. In Part 1, we tour founding myths of America. In Part 2, we expose the shadow networks, the secret societies, the private bankers, and the hidden hands behind the assassinations of leaders who dared to challenge the system. But there is another chapter of hidden American history that is perhaps the most consequential of all. Because it is not ancient history. It is not decades ago. It is the history of wars. Wars that were sold to the American people on lies. Wars that were manufactured, staged, and launched not to protect freedom, but to protect profit. Welcome to Part 3 of the Hidden History of the USA. Let us start with a date that changed everything. August 4, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin. President Lyndon B. Johnson went before the American people and announced that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had launched an unprovoked attack on American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. He used this attack as justification to massively escalate American military involvement in Vietnam. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving the president unlimited authority to wage war in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. And America entered one of the longest, bloodiest, and most controversial conflicts in its entire history. Over 58,000 American soldiers dead, an estimated 2 to 3 million Vietnamese civilians killed. An entire generation of young Americans scarred forever by a war they were told was necessary to stop the spread of communism. There was just one problem. The attack never happened. The second Gulf of Tonkin attack, the one that triggered the resolution, the one that justified the entire escalation, was fabricated. Invented. Made up. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented historical fact. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense who helped sell the war to the American people, admitted it himself decades later. The signal's intelligence was misread. The attack did not occur. 58,000 Americans died. Millions of Vietnamese died. An entire region of the world was bombed back to the Stone Age, based on an attack that never happened. But the Gulf of Tonkin was not the first time America started a war on lies, and it would not be the last. Let us go back further to 1898, the Spanish-American War. The U.S. Maine, an American battleship, exploded in Havana Harbor in Cuba. 266 American sailors were killed. American newspapers, particularly those owned by media William Randolph Hearst, immediately blamed Spain. Remember, the Maine became a national rallying cry. America declared war on Spain. And in the space of just a few months, the United States seized control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. A perfect little empire built on the ruins of one suspicious explosion. But subsequent investigations, including a U.S. Navy investigation in 1976, found that the most likely cause of the explosion was an internal accident, not a Spanish attack. The war that launched the American empire was built on a lie printed in a newspaper owned by a man who wanted the war to happen. William Randolph Hearst famously wrote to his photographer in Cuba, "You furnish the pictures and I will furnish the war." He meant it literally. Now let us come to the event that defined the 21st century. September 11, 2001. We are not here today to debate what happened on that day. We are here to examine what happened after. Because the response to September 11 fundamentally transformed the United States and the world in ways that were planned, prepared, and ready to execute before the towers ever fell. 5 weeks after September 11, the USAPR Act was signed into law, a 342-page document, signed just 45 days after the attacks. Legislation of that complexity does not get written in 45 days. It was already written, already waiting, already on the shelf, ready for the moment of crisis that would make the American people accept it without question. The Patriot Act eliminated key constitutional protections. It allowed warrantless surveillance of American citizens. It allowed indefinite detention. It allowed the government to monitor your phone calls, your emails, your library records, your financial transactions, without a court order, without your knowledge, without your consent. And it was passed with almost no debate, because the American people were terrified. And terrified people do not ask questions. They just say, "Keep us safe. Do whatever it takes. Keep us safe." Then came the war in Afghanistan. Then came the war in Iraq. And with Iraq came the most consequential lie of the 21st century: weapons of mass destruction. Secretary of State Colin Powell stood before the United Nations Security Council on February 5, 2003. He presented satellite images. He presented audio recordings. He presented detailed intelligence reports. He told the world, with absolute certainty, that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Chemical weapons. Biological weapons. A nuclear program in development. The threat was real. The threat was imminent. The threat required immediate military action. The United States invaded Iraq in March 2003. By the time the invasion was over 4 American soldiers were dead. An estimated 150,000 to 600,000 Iraqi civilians were killed. An entire country was destroyed. Its infrastructure obliterated. Its society torn apart. Sectarian violence unleashed that continues to this day. And the weapons of mass destruction. They were never found. Not one. Not a single chemical weapon. Not a single biological weapon. Not a trace of a nuclear program. Nothing. Colin Powell himself, in his memoir, called his UN presentation a blot on his record. A painful blot. The intelligence was wrong. Or the intelligence was manipulated. Or both. But here is what was not wrong. The no-bid contracts handed to Halliburton, the defense and energy company formerly led by Vice President Dick Cheney, to rebuild Iraq, worth billions of dollars. Here is what was not wrong. The oil fields of Iraq, the second largest proven oil reserves in the world, suddenly opened for business to Western energy companies. Here is what was not wrong. The defense industry stocks that soared throughout the entire duration of the Iraq War, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, General Dynamics, their profits reached record highs while Iraq burned. Somebody always profits from war. The question is never whether the war makes money. The question is always, who is making it? And who is dying so they can make it? But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the post-September 11th world is not the wars themselves. It is not the wars we're used to build at home. The surveillance state. Before September 11th, the idea that the American government was secretly monitoring all of its citizens' communications would have been dismissed as paranoid fantasy. After September 11th, it became law. After Edward Snowden leaked classified NSA documents in 2013, the world learned the truth. The NSA, the National Security Agency, had built a system of mass surveillance so comprehensive, so invasive, so total, that it collected data on virtually every single phone call, email, and internet search made by every American citizen. Every day, every hour, every minute, not terrorists, not suspects. Every American, every person, all of them, all the time. The Constitution of the United States guaranteed protection against unreasonable search and seizure. But in the years after September 11th, the government decided that the Constitution was an obstacle, not a foundation. And the American people, still frightened, still grateful for security, largely accepted it, because that is how it works. Crisis creates fear. Fear creates compliance. Compliance creates control. And control, once established, is almost never voluntarily given back. In Part 4, we go further still. The war on drugs that was never really about drugs. The prison industrial complex that profits from human incarceration. the systematic destruction of Black and Latino communities through policy designed to look like law enforcement. And the man who helped design it, who admitted on his deathbed what it was really for. The hidden history of America has no shortage of darkness. But the darkest chapters are often the ones closest to home. In Part 3, we expose the wars built on lies, the Gulf of Tonkin fabrication, the weapons of mass destruction that never existed, the surveillance state constructed on the ruins of American fear. But now we turn to a war that was fought not on foreign soil, but on American streets. Against American citizens, a war declared with great fanfare and moral authority. A war that has lasted over 50 years. A war that has consumed trillions of dollars and millions of lives. And a war that, according to one of its own architects, was never really about what they told you it was about. This is the story of the war on drugs, and it is one of the darkest chapters in the entire hidden history of the United States of America. On June 17, 1971, President Richard Nixon stood before the American people and declared drug abuse public enemy number one. He called for a total war against drugs. He dramatically increased federal funding for drug enforcement. He created the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, and he told America that this was a moral crusade, a fight to protect families, a fight to protect communities, a fight to protect the soul of the nation. It was a lie, not an exaggeration, not a misguided policy, a deliberate, calculated, documented lie. We know this because of John Ehrlichman. John Ehrlichman was Nixon's domestic policy advisor, one of his closest aides, one of the men sitting in the room when the war on drugs was designed. And in 1994, more than 2 decades after the war on drugs began, Ehrlichman gave an interview to journalist Dan Baum. In that interview, he said something so explosive, so damning, so utterly devastating, that it should have ended the war on drugs overnight. He said, and these are his words, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Of course we did. Read those words again. The war on drugs was not a public health policy. It was not a moral crusade. It was a political weapon, deliberately designed to destroy 2 specific communities, Black Americans and anti-war activists, by criminalizing their existence. And it worked. It worked beyond anything Nixon could have imagined. Because the war on drugs did not end with Nixon. It accelerated. Under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, the war on drugs reached a new level of intensity and a new level of targeting. The crack cocaine epidemic hit Black urban communities in America in the mid-1980s with devastating force. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Families were torn apart. Young men were pulled off streets and thrown into prison by the hundreds of thousands. And the Reagan administration responded with mandatory minimum sentences, laws that required judges to impose fixed prison terms for drug offenses regardless of circumstances. Possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine, the form of cocaine prevalent in Black communities, carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in federal prison. Possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine, the form prevalent in white wealthy communities, carried the same 5-year sentence. 100 to 1. The same drug, the same molecule, 100 times the sentencing disparity, based purely on which community was using which form. This was not an accident. This was policy. And it filled American prisons with Black men at a rate that had no parallel in the history of the industrialized world. By the 1990s, the United States had become the most incarcerated nation on earth. More people in prison per capita than any country in the world. More than Russia. More than China. More than any authoritarian regime America had ever criticized. And the majority of those prisoners were Black and Latino men, convicted of nonviolent drug offenses, serving years and decades in cages while violent criminals in white-collar offices walked free. But here is the part of this story that goes even deeper. Because the crack cocaine that destroyed Black communities in the 1980s, where did it come from? In 1996, investigative journalist Gary Webb published a series of articles in the San Jose Mercury News titled Dark Alliance. Webb had spent years investigating the origins of the crack cocaine epidemic, and what he found was extraordinary. Webb documented connections between the CIA, Nicaraguan Contra rebels, and the crack cocaine supply that flooded into Los Angeles and other American cities in the 1980s. The Contras were the armed rebel group that the Reagan administration was secretly funding. The leftist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Congress had passed the Boland Amendment, explicitly prohibiting the U.S. government from funding the Contras. So the Reagan administration found another way to fund them. And according to Webb's investigation, part of that funding came from allowing Contra-connected drug traffickers to import cocaine into the United States with the knowledge and protection of elements within the CIA. The CIA was protecting drug smugglers. The drugs were destroying black communities. Those communities were then criminalized by the war on drugs. And the money from the drug trade was funding illegal covert operations that Congress had explicitly prohibited. This was not theory. Webb had documents. He had sources. He had corroboration. The major American newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, responded not by investigating his findings, but by attacking him personally. They published piece questioning his methodology, his credibility, his mental stability. The CIA itself released a statement dismissing his work. Gary Webb was effectively destroyed professionally. His career collapsed. His marriage ended. In 2004, Gary Webb was found dead in his apartment. He had been shot twice in the head. The official ruling was suicide. The official story said he shot himself in the head. Twice. The war on drugs destroyed communities. The prison industrial complex profited from those communities. And the journalist who tried to expose the connection between the government and the drug supply that started it all ended up dead with 2 bullets in his head, ruled a suicide. Meanwhile, the prison industry was booming. In 1980, there were approximately 500,000 people in American prisons and jails. By 2008, that number had exploded to 3 million, a 360% increase. And driving that explosion, private prison corporations. Companies like Corrections Corporation of America and GEO Group that built and operated prisons for profit. These companies charged the government per prisoner per day, which means their profit model depended on keeping prisons full. Which means their profit model required more arrests, longer sentences, fewer paroles. Which means they lobbied aggressively and successfully for exactly those policies. Private prison companies spent millions of dollars lobbying for mandatory minimum sentences. They lobbied against early release programs. They lobbied against drug rehabilitation alternatives. They lobbied for policies that guarantee their prisons would remain full and their shareholders would remain wealthy. Human beings, overwhelmingly black and Latino, became a commodity, a product, a source of revenue, warehoused in cages so that corporations could profit from their incarceration. Michelle Alexander, in her landmark book The New Jim Crow, argued that mass incarceration in America functions as a new racial caste system, as comprehensive and devastating in its effects as the Jim Crow laws of the segregation era. The names changed. The mechanisms changed. But the result, the systematic exclusion, control, and subjugation of black Americans, remained remarkably consistent across 2 centuries of American history. From slavery, to black codes, to Jim Crow, to mass incarceration, the system evolved. But the target never changed. In Part 5 we go further, the destruction of the American middle class, the deliberate export of jobs, the financial crisis of 2008 that transferred trillions of dollars from ordinary Americans to the banks that caused the crisis, and the political system that made all of it not just possible, but legal. The hidden history of America is a long story, and we are not finished yet. In Part 4, we expose the war on drugs for what it truly was, not a moral crusade, not a public health initiative, but a deliberate political weapon designed to destroy black communities and silence dissent. We saw how the prison industrial complex turned human beings into commodities. We saw how a journalist who got too close to the truth ended up dead with 2 bullets in his head, ruled a suicide. But now we turn to a chapter that affects not just one community, but every single working American, every family, every household, every person who has ever worked a job, paid a bill, or tried to build a better life. This is the story of the deliberate destruction of the American middle class. And it is a story that begins not with a bang, but with a signature. On January 1, 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, came into effect. It was sold to the American people as a historic economic achievement. A free trade deal between the United States, Canada, and Mexico that would create jobs, lower prices, and boost prosperity for everyone. President Bill Clinton stood before the cameras and promised that NAFTA would create 200,000 American jobs in its first 2 years alone. It was one of the most consequential lies in modern American economic history. Within 10 years of NAFTA coming into effect, the United States had lost approximately 1 million manufacturing jobs. Not gained. Lost 1 million jobs. Gone to Mexico. Gone to places where corporations could pay workers not $20 an hour, but $2 a day. Factories that had employed entire communities for generations closed overnight. Steel towns in Pennsylvania, textile towns in North Carolina, auto parts manufacturers in Michigan and Ohio, furniture makers in Virginia. One by one, the lights went out, and the communities built around those factories did not recover. They collapsed, unemployment soared. Tax bases evaporated. Schools deteriorated. Infrastructure crumbled. Drug abuse exploded. Suicide rates climbed. Entire regions of the United States, places that had once been the proud industrial backbone of the most powerful economy in the world, became what economists began calling the Rust Belt. The Rust Belt. As if the decay of these communities was as natural and inevitable as rust forming on metal. As if it just happened on its own. As if nobody decided it. As if nobody chose it, but somebody decided it. Somebody chose it. The corporations that moved their factories to Mexico did not do it reluctantly. They did it eagerly, enthusiastically, because labor costs dropped by 90%, because environmental regulations disappeared, because worker safety protections evaporated, because profit margins exploded, and the politicians who signed NAFTA and who pushed it through Congress received millions of dollars in campaign contributions from the very corporations that benefited from it. This was not free trade. This was the organized looting of the American working class, conducted legally, openly, and with the full cooperation of both political parties, because NAFTA was not a Republican achievement or a Democratic achievement. It was negotiated by Republican President George H.W. Bush. It was signed by Democratic President Bill Clinton. It was supported by majorities in both parties in Congress. The working class had no party. The working class had no lobby. The working class had only their votes. And their votes kept going to the same politicians who kept selling them out. But NAFTA was only the beginning, because in 2001, China was admitted to the World Trade Organization, and American corporations discovered something even more profitable than Mexico. A country of 1.4 billion people where factory workers earned less than $1 an hour. Where there were no unions, no environmental protections, no worker safety standards worth speaking of, where the government would do anything, to attract foreign investment and manufacturing. The China shock, as economists came to call it, devastated American manufacturing on a scale that dwarfed even NAFTA. Between 2001 and 2011, the United States lost approximately 2.4 million manufacturing jobs directly attributable to Chinese import competition. 2.4 million jobs in 10 years. Entire industries did not just shrink, they ceased to exist in America. Electronics manufacturing, gone. Furniture manufacturing, gone. Textile and apparel manufacturing, gone. Toy manufacturing, gone. Solar panel manufacturing, gone almost before it began. And with each factory that closed, with each community that collapsed, the executives who made those decisions collected bonuses. The shareholders who profited from cheaper production costs collected dividends, and the politicians who enabled it all collected campaign contributions. Then came 2008, the financial crisis. The moment when the entire architecture of American financial deception finally, catastrophically collapsed and revealed itself for exactly what it was. For most of the 2000s, American banks had been engaged in the most reckless, fraudulent, and destructive financial behavior in modern history. They had created something called mortgage-backed securities, complex financial instruments that bundled together thousands of home mortgages and sold them to investors around the world. The problem was that many of those mortgages were subprime, given to people who could not realistically afford them. Banks were handing out mortgages to people with no income, no job, and no assets. These were called NJ loans, no income, no job, no assets. And the banks did not care whether the borrowers could repay, because they immediately packaged those mortgages into securities and sold them to someone else. The risk was passed on. The fees were collected up front, and the entire system depended on housing prices rising forever. When housing prices stopped rising, when they began to fall, the entire structure collapsed like a house of cards. millions of Americans lost their homes. Retirement accounts were wiped out. College savings funds evaporated. Jobs disappeared by the millions. The stock market lost half its value. The greatest transfer of wealth from ordinary Americans to the financial elite in modern history was underway. And the United States government responded by doing something extraordinary. Something that would have been unthinkable in any genuine free market economy. They bailed out the banks. The same banks that had caused the crisis. The same banks that had committed what many economists and legal scholars described as massive financial fraud. The same banks whose executives had collected hundreds of millions of dollars in bonuses while building the house of cards that destroyed the savings of millions of ordinary Americans. The government gave them trillions. The Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, authorized $700 billion in bailout funds. The Federal Reserve, through various emergency programs, provided an additional $16 trillion in loans and guarantees to financial institutions. $16 trillion to the banks that caused the crisis. And what happened to the bankers who caused it? Not one senior Wall Street executive was criminally prosecuted for their role in the 2008 financial crisis. Not one. The Department of Justice, under both the Bush and Obama administrations, decided that the banks were too big to fail, and the bankers were too big to jail. Too big to jail. Meanwhile, over 9 million Americans lost their homes to foreclosure. 26 million Americans were unemployed or underemployed at the peak of the crisis. 50 million Americans fell into poverty, and the banks, bailed out with public money, protected from prosecution by public officials, returned to record profits within 2 years. The system was not broken in 2008. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. It transferred wealth upward. It protected the powerful. It punished the ordinary. And then it made sure that nothing would ever fundamentally change. In Part 6, the final chapter, we bring it all together. The surveillance state. The permanent war economy. The bought political system. The media that keeps you distracted. And the question that everything in this series has been building toward. What do we do now? The hidden history of America ends not with despair, but with a challenge. And that challenge is directed at you. We have traveled a long road together. In Part 1, we tore apart the founding myths. The Declaration of Independence written by slaveholders. The treaties signed and broken. The robber barons who built their empires on the broken backs of workers and children. In Part 2, we descended into the shadow networks. The secret meeting on Jekyll Island that gave private bankers control of the American money. Supplied the secret societies operating behind the walls of Yale and Washington. The assassinations of leaders who dared to challenge the system. In Part 3, we exposed the wars built on lies. The Gulf of Tonkin attack that never happened. The weapons of mass destruction that never existed. The surveillance state constructed from the rubble of American fear. In Part 4, we confronted the war on drugs, exposed by its own architect as a weapon designed to destroy black communities and silence dissent. We saw the prison industrial complex turn human beings into profit. We saw a journalist silenced with 2 bullets in his head. In Part 5, we watched the deliberate destruction of the American middle class. NAFTA, the China shock, the financial crisis of 2008, the bailout of the banks that caused it, the prosecution of nobody. This is the hidden history of the United States of America. 6 parts. 100 years, one consistent thread. Power protecting itself, at the expense of everyone else. But this final chapter is not about the past. This final chapter is about right now. And about what comes next. Because here is the most important truth of everything we have covered in this entire series. The system we have described, this vast interconnected apparatus of financial power, political corruption, media control, military expansion, and social manipulation. This system does not sustain itself through pure force. Dictatorships sustain themselves through force. What America has built is far more sophisticated than a dictatorship. America sustains its system of control through consent. Through the willing participation of the people being controlled. And that consent is manufactured. Manufactured through the education system that teaches children a sanitized mythology instead of honest history. Manufactured through the media system that floods your consciousness with entertainment, outrage and distraction, keeping you perpetually busy, perpetually divided, perpetually focused on everything except the mechanisms of your own control. Manufactured through the political system that gives you a choice between 2 candidates, both funded by the same corporations, both members of the same networks, both committed to the same fundamental economic arrangements, while making you feel that your choice matters. Manufactured through the consumer economy that measures your worth by what you own, keeps you in permanent debt to finance that ownership, and ensures that your financial survival is dependent on not disrupting the system that exploits you. This is what the philosopher Antonio Gramsci called cultural hegemony. The ability of the ruling class to present its own interests as the natural order of things. To make the values, assumptions, and worldview of the powerful seem like common sense to everyone. To make you defend the system that oppresses you because you have been convinced that the system is you. When a working-class person defends the interests of billionaires against taxation, that is manufactured consent. When a soldier from a poor community fights a war that makes defense contractors rich, that is manufactured consent. When a Black or Latino voter chooses between two candidates both committed to mass incarceration, that is manufactured consent. When an American worker blames immigrants for job losses caused by corporate trade policies, that is manufactured consent. The system does not need you to love it. It only needs you to keep participating in it, to keep voting within it, to keep consuming within it, to keep working within it, to keep fighting each other within it. So long as your energy is directed horizontally, at your neighbors, at other races, at other political parties, at other nations, it is never directed vertically, at the system itself, at the people at the top of the system, at the mechanisms that keep the system running. Divide and conquer is not a metaphor. It is the operational strategy of every system of concentrated power in human history. And it works every single time. Until it doesn't. Because here is the other truth, the one they are most afraid of you knowing. Every system of concentrated power in human history has eventually ended. Every empire has fallen. Every authoritarian structure has collapsed. Every system that concentrated wealth and power in the hands of the few, at the expense of the many, has eventually been confronted, challenged, and transformed. Not always peacefully, not always quickly, not always completely, not always eventually, the people have moved. The question is never whether change is possible. The question is always, what kind of change? And that question is answered by what ordinary people choose to do with what they know. Knowledge is not enough on its own. History is full of people who knew the truth and did nothing, who understood the system and accepted it anyway, who saw the injustice and decided that their own comfort was more important than someone else's freedom. Knowledge becomes power only when it becomes action, and action does not require everyone. It never has. Every major transformation in human history was initiated by a relatively small number of people who refused to accept the reality they had been handed. The abolitionists who ended slavery were a tiny minority. The suffragettes who won women the right to vote were dismissed as radicals. The labor organizers who fought for the 8-hour workday, the weekend, and child labor laws were called dangerous communists by the newspapers of their day. The civil rights movement that dismantled legal segregation faced the full force of the American state, the FBI, the police, the courts, and it did not stop. It did not stop because the people in it understood something fundamental. That the most powerful force in human history is not money. It is not weapons. It is not surveillance technology. It is not propaganda. The most powerful force in human history is people who have decided, clearly, firmly, and without going back, that things cannot continue as they are. So what do we do with the hidden history of the United States of America? We do not despair. Despair is a luxury of the comfortable, and a weapon of the powerful. They want you to feel that the system is too big, too entrenched, too powerful to challenge. They want you to feel alone. They want you to feel helpless. They want you to turn off the video, go back to your phone, and forget you ever started asking questions. We do not comply. Instead, we remember. We remember that the same country that enslaved human beings also produced the abolitionists who ended it. The same country that massacred Native Americans also produced Native leaders who fought back and never stopped fighting. The same country that sent troops to gun down striking workers also produced a labor movement that won rights enjoyed by hundreds of millions of people to this day. The same country that built the surveillance state also produced Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Daniel Ellsberg, people who risked everything to tell the truth. America has always contained both the system of control and the people who refuse to accept it. The hidden history of America is not just a history of power and corruption. It is also a history of resistance, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of people who looked at the world as it was and decided to fight for the world as it should be. That fight is not over. It has never been over. And now it belongs to you. You have watched 6 parts of Hidden History. You have seen the lies behind the founding myths. You have seen the shadow networks, the manufactured wars, the deliberate destruction of communities, the financial crimes, the media manipulation. You cannot unsee it. And that is exactly where it begins. Share this video. Talk about what you have learned. Ask the questions you were never supposed to ask. Connect with others who are asking the same questions. Support independent journalism. Support community organizations. Support anyone and anything that is working to make the hidden history visible and to build something better in its place. The hidden history of America is not the final chapter. It is the chapter before the one that has not been written yet. And that chapter, the one that comes after all of this, that chapter is yours to write. Thank you for watching. Thank you for questioning. Thank you for refusing to look away. The truth always was, and always will be, worth fighting for.